Hello, everyone. Welcome. We have a show today entitled A View from Nowhere. It was originally aired on the Locals channel, and it was aired on September 9th of this year. And I'm putting it out there for your consideration. It was a reading from chapter 3 of Seeing Through the Singularity. We put 3 pieces of content out each week, some of it dealing with the 2 books and connecting it to current events, others dealing with memory hold material or stuff that's not suitable for YouTube. And so I encourage people to check it out. The links will be in the description section for our Locals channel. But again, this is just sort of a sampling of what we do over there. So in chapter 3, what we're getting at is sort of the beginning of the movement of evolution, and in particular, the eugenics movement. So, two of the kind of big trends in the world that we sort of delve into are this movement towards singularity and the movement toward Noahide or Noahide laws, and how they're converging at a single point. And I think this year we're off to a lot of crazy events, and we try to think like, where are all these things taking us? And underneath these events, there is, we argue, a cosmic conspiracy, an agenda that's taking place. And we see a lot of this from the World Economic Forum kind of boldly proclaiming their agenda that you are going to integrate with technology. You're going to become part of the singularity. You're going to become a cyborg and live in the metaverse. And so these are boldly proclaimed. And what I think is interesting here is the foundations of this thought, because underneath it is really this concept of transhumanism. We're in kind of a transition, our humanness. And the deep ideas underseating transhumanism are, on the one hand, humanism. That's an idea that came out of the Renaissance. And on the other end, it's eugenics. And so I spent quite a few years really digging into eugenics, and this is a sample of what I came up with. And I think it's helpful to understand what the World Economic Forum and all of the sort of singularitarians that are enthusiastic about merging with technology, what's the real baseline underneath that in terms of what are their thoughts? Where do these come from? So I probe deeply in this chapter into very arcane literature from the eugenics movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially journals where I would call it like sort of their epistemic networking, their idea center when they're coming together. What's the idea that they're envisioning? And it kind of probes on the idea of what are eugenicists all about, the Bill Gates and the Yuval Hararis of the world, that they want to kind of herd humanity into a particular vision of their own. So one of the things we're probing in here, those original epistemic network groups, their thinking and where they're coming from. And there's not a lot of bells and whistles in this presentation, but if you hang with it, I think there's a magic moment where one of the writers in 1910 cites that they're really waiting for this magic moment when the information is complete, and they're going to wage a jihad, a holy war, and they're going to unleash their final agenda. So what I think they had as a community, a network, kind of envisioned way back then, I believe we're seeing it come out each day here in the year 2005. So without any further ado, I am going to present to you a view from nowhere.
This ability to take, in fact, I think Bill first talked about information at your fingertips at Comdex in 93. And this is more about intelligence at your fingertips or expertise at your fingertips. And that's, I think, the era we're definitely in. And I think 24 will probably be the year where all of this will scale.
Yeah. Satya, I have to confess, some of the introductions of people which I had to write, I wrote with ChatGPT. But don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. No, there's a lot of discussion about AI during this meeting, and we talk about impact. We may later talk about productivity, particularly in the context of the economy. But what is overlooked in this discussion? Do you feel we talk about impact on skills and so on? What is overlooked in your opinion?
I mean, it's not overlooked, but I think what is salient, I think, is obviously I talked a lot about what it's going to do to horizontal knowledge work and frontline work, but I think it's about what AI will do to science, perhaps is the most interesting thing to me, because in fact, just last week, we announced something which, I sort of felt like, yeah, this is something that can be done, but I had not understood that this can be done. So we took one of our models called MatterGen, which is a sort of a generative model to generate new molecules and material. And we put it through an entire round trip where we came up with new molecules for a new material, worked with in collaboration with one of the national labs in the United States, the Pacific Northwest National Lab, and figured out how to produce a new battery that's got 70% less lithium. Right, that's just phenomenal to sort of when we think about the climate, the energy transition. It's about taking 250 years of chemistry and somehow bringing it down to 25 years, right? So this is a proof point of that. Same thing is happening in biology. I see Jim in the front row here. If I think about what we're doing even with PAGE and what we can do with cancer detection, or what we're doing with Broad again in molecular in biology, and to be able to use AI to simulate the molecular behavior. So I think that science is probably the place where we will start seeing real acceleration. So up to now, the digitization revolution has brought new tools to science, but has not fundamentally accelerated science. But if you can fundamentally accelerate science, the cures to diseases, the energy transition, fundamental new material science, all of these I think are going to be pretty profound.
Now, everybody talks about AI, but actually there are many other technologies in the fourth industrial revolution, and I think it's particularly the combination of AI with some of those technologies. What other technologies create this progress for society, in your opinion?
On the technology front, I'm always sort of, anchoring back to three things, right? One is when it comes to the core compute infrastructure, we just need more of it. So we have the von Neumann machine that still rules the world. And the question is, can we birth the new quantum revolution? So I'm always excited about quantum. In fact, some of what we're seeing is AI as the emulation layer for what is going to be the simulation layer, which is quantum, right?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session where we are thinking through the in-between of the singularity and Noahide laws. And we're working from the book, Seeing Through the Singularity. And you could see from that presentation there at the World Economic Forum, the future looks more horizontal, the mergers of new technologies, and this promise of curing disease, eternal life, and a really utopian vision of man. And today I want to talk about where that acceleration that he's talking about really began. And I'm going to work from chapter number 3, and that's called A View from Nowhere. A View from Nowhere. And I'm going to put a picture up here if I can, if it works. And it's a shot that is on the cover, the thumbnail there, and that is, it very much seems to be within the genre of English painters we often think of as the Romantic movement. and that corresponds with the Romantic poets. And it's really creates a ethos, or maybe we could even say a zeitgeist for the era. And it's really a pulling away, if you think of the poets and the painters of this time, pulling away from the traditional view of reality, where it's fixed, hierarchical, and historical. And it's this idea that would, of course, stem from the Protestant Revolution. It would stem from the Renaissance. It would stem from the Enlightenment era. And this idea that we kind of dreamed that God, that man is the measure of all things, that he can truly, the sky is the limit, apotheosis. And this is sort of the world, this free suspension of things that we're living in today. And the discussion, I believe, that was taking place at the World Economic Forum really epitomizes this, what we've called an egregore, a mind virus, that you're captured in this self-referential reality where you start to truly believe your own hubris and your own hype about the potentials of man, the further you get away from the ultimate reality, which is Christ and his church. So, but it's a nifty painting. I've always been attracted to the aesthetics of that movement, and the readings that we're going to delve into here today have a very English tone to them. It was a rising empire. A lot of this, I have argued in my book, In Pursuit of the Metaverse, was an empire of man. And it was propelled by all those things, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the Protestant Revolution. And it would, the Romantic movement would sort of turn into the age of the Industrial Revolution. So the thinkers that we're going to talk today are both steeped in the Romantic ethos of that time and uh, the really increased the acceleration of English power in the world, English industrialism, and the thoughts associated with that. And oftentimes um, we think about this sort of social Darwinism and this eugenics that comes with that age of industrial revolution, and the ideas that man and machine are pictured as one. And so there's a real idea there. The Scottish sociologist / economist Adam Smith would say in 1776, when he's creating this idea of the wealth of nations and viewing a new world of possibilities, and he viewed a world in which man would become more like machines and machines would become more like men. And now people seem to embrace that, at least the sort of folks that are at the World Economic Forum, as being this realization of a long dream, a dream that has been around for a long time. And in some sense, it's a dream that's been around ever since the serpent in the garden. And so a quick recap. We started out with the first little opening of the singularity in chapter 1. And this is sort of where this whole idea is going. We have on the one hand, the technological singularity, but on the other, how does Noahide laws, this law of the new fourth industrial revolution age, which people don't usually link, but it's really the Messianic era. These new laws that are going to come around that are going to move us from the reality of the church, stable, hierarchical, historical, into a detached reality, detached from all those things, a view from nowhere. And so the Noahide laws are going to work just as the technological singularity to bring everything into one. It's sort of this view, I would argue, this pagan view behind it is pantheistic monism. So from the book of Revelation 17:13, we have one mind and shall give their these have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. And they are giving it. So there's still an era of free will, but I think once that's given, I think that's part of the consciousness that's given over is the free will of man or human. And so that's prophetically what we're working for when we're thinking about Noahide and singularity. And then I define briefly, because it's a complex subdiscipline of political science that works in high tech, and this idea that inevitably there is this movement toward what Adam Smith talked about, a merger of man and machine. Biopolitics is ultimately about the physical, mental, and spiritual control of the whole human population. Let me insert there, probably by blockchain, or what I would call the blockchain of becoming, this aspiration. Technological singularity functions within the enduring matrix of control. It strives toward the inversion of the cosmic order through the inversion of logos. That is, it strives toward the creation of one mind that will reverse engineer creation. And so we talked about that a bit, and we talked about briefly something called the biopolitics and the egregore of the evolving man. And we're going to really get into that when we talk about the view from nowhere. But that's this, first of all, an egregore we defined as a metaphysical term, kind of esoteric, for a group consciousness like zeitgeist or an archetype. It is derived from the Hebrew word angel and also from city, sort of with the powers and principalities of the fallen ones. It is a quote unquote thought form or a collective group mind, and it is created, whether intentionally or not, when people invoke a thought form. Today, in modern media, it's especially the pictures in our head that are generated. Much like an intelligent morphic effect or mimetic, and sentience, a psychic entity is created, then leaves an acquired life of its own. It takes on an acquired life of its own. So what I've been arguing here is that there are eternal forms. And I think the Catholic Church baptized those Platonic ideas. There are eternal forms. Certainly, St. Augustine thought about that when he thought about the city of man as based in eternal forms. The city of God's based on eternal forms like family, nation, and even empire, including the Christian empire. And I've always argued that's the fullness of reality. It requires history. It's historical, sacramental, and hierarchical. And so we approach the fullness of our reality through toward Christ and his heavenly kingdom through the church. The city of man, by contrast, does not have an eternal form. So it requires these egregores, the constant generation of new forms. And in the modern world, it's taken on things like mass media, propaganda, and all of the sin that goes with reproducing these ideas. And it's a migration from the ancient spectacle into our modern spectacle that I've called the empire of spectacle that surrounds us all today. And it includes all of the, politics and society, the military, media, pharmaceutical, legislative, industrial complex that takes controls of our mind that scripture thinks of worldliness. And those in love with these things fall victim to the deception from those things. And part of that is attaching ourselves to these thought forms. So I'm going to begin with chapter 3. And we're going to go over this. And today I have the book with me, so I don't have to be bending my head down all the time. So we'll go over this and reflect on this a little bit. It's called Chapter 3, A View from Nowhere. And I put I uploaded that picture because it's a nice picture in your head to think. In some ways, that picture seems to me, there's a certain ethereal beauty to it and a sort of triumphant. It has a triumphant tone to it, but yet there's a brooding sort of darkness, I think, that's there. We do see an atomized individual. Perhaps he represents all men, or perhaps he's truly atomized, and it is man with his own ideas within the city of man, disconnected forever from the city of God. So I see it, it kind of has two kind of feelings to it. As a young man, I particularly liked the romantic genre and was attracted to it. And I still aesthetically think it's kind of, it has a pull to me. I think just the tone of that genre of painters, they're particularly English painters. But let's get to it. Here's chapter chapter 3, A View from Nowhere. And we'll begin here. There is a grandeur, just so we know where we're going. This is Charles Darwin from Origin of the Species. There is a grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. So, this is where we're going. This idea of everything, reality, meaning, and purpose being grounded in the fixed notions that were provided by the revelation of scripture and tradition. And this is the introduction to A View of Nowhere, that word evolution. And I just mentioned the idea it's an egregore of an evolving universe. It's really everything. The universe is evolving. Because when I said the idea that there's a fixed universe, and I juxtaposed it, the inversion of the evolutionary tale is everything is exactly. It could be a lot of different ways, but it's exactly opposite. So there's a metaphysical and ethereal power that's pulling us into this view, and it is a view that's largely conquered, we said, the modern mind, and especially through the organs of information, and in particular the university system. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. Genesis 1:2-5. God saw that it was good. His creation, intention, and cosmic order was good. Until the 19th century, species were believed to be fixed. They were understood to be good, existing as they were within a particular creation, intention, and order. Charles Darwin, Origin of Species, 1859, was, in the words of Gertrude Himmelfarb, quote, the cataclysm that broke up the crust of conventional opinion, end quote. Not only about the fixity of species, but about the need for a new politics of science. And it's a whole new worldview that was unleashed. And I think we don't really appreciate just how comprehensive this notion was of breaking those eternal forms open. And that's, I argue, how God speaks to us through forms, meaning they have boundaries and outlines. Think of a cat, a dog, but other forms that exist in. When you break that form, the eternal forms are spoken to us. And we know that God also speaks through us through typology, forms. When people say, oh, that's a generalization, you can't say that. And that's the language that God uses, not only to have creation, but to have us understand our potential eternal destiny through the ideas of forms. The cataclysm suggested from Darwin's proposition that species developed within a quote-unquote struggle for existence, and only organisms best adapted to their environment would succeed in rearing offspring, while those less fit would die off. The variants most suited to their environment would predominate, and over time, this would result in the emergence of new species. The egregore, or thought form, behind the origins of species implied the possibility of human mutability, outlined within a simple mechanism by which the transmutation of species could occur. Um, I'm grabbed right now by that term because it seems very similar to the word transubstantiation, where something truly miraculous in the city of God has its always its typological inversion in the city of man. And so I'd heard Michael Matt saying last night, somebody quoted the idea of a refrain among women these days that this is my body, how that's like an inverted um, phrase, satanic phrase from Christ at the Last Supper saying, "This is my body." So that just grabbed me as I'm reading that. The transmutation of species could occur. That's the idea, that when that idea took hold throughout the human population, we have the world basically that we live in today. Quote, it was objective, it could be seen at work, it could be tested by experiment, it could be extended by observation. And that's what we call, of course, scientific law, which is consistent with um, it's consistent with scripture, right? Something that's observable, measurable, and reproducible is the scientific method. Um, and that is the tricky part here that still goes on today, because when we talk about the idea of selection, that most scientists will agree that there is a type of selection that occurs at the micro level. We breed dogs and so forth, but usually the sort of trick, sort of the Kabbalistic sleight of hand, is that when that's extrapolated or um, forced into a macro lens. And there, when you really get down to something that's observable, measurable, and reproducible, that's where the break goes. And you have to follow the sort of sophistry of this. But in most cases, people have this egregore of um, man living forever in another way that's inside of their heads. That it's really helpful when the person receiving it is losing the graces because they're pulling away from the fullness of reality of the church. So, but it appears that it has this, and this was the idea then, and now it appears to have this veneer of science and the scientific method. It was objective. It could be seen at work. It could be tested by experiment. It could be extended by observation, predicated, as it were, upon the assumption that transmutate, and that's what it is. It's predicated upon the assumption. It seems scientific if you assume that transmutation of species could occur, could transcend and reorder what was good creation, what was good creation, intention, and cosmic order. So once you leave the church and assume that God couldn't have created that, because that's what you're rejecting. God's created order, his intention of the cosmic order. C.S. Lewis observed the revolutionary shift in man's perspective away from his concern for the ethical, rhetorical, and juristic toward a new scientific order. He notes, quote, science became the business of man when man became the business of science. What Watt applied himself to the invention of the steam engine and Darwin to the ancestry of man. And again, I believe the fundamental flaw there in the thinking then and now was the conflation of those ideas that we can sort of, through animal husbandry, we can produce a new banana, a different breed of dog. But from that conflation, thinking that all boundaries and categories were possible, that's where the magic happens. And egregores, this thought poison, is the result of us not being grounded in the fullness of reality, which is Christ and his church. Darwin's Origin of Species, 1859, would serve as the Rosetta Stone for these aims. Okay, I'm sorry, went a little fast. It was this revolution where man became the business of science that resurrected the ancient spiritual impulse to invert, transcend, and the cosmic order. In this respect, I argue, it became a spiritual cult within politics, fundamentally messianic, with aims to, quote, number one, harness technology toward the quote unquote improvement of the soul, and to, number two, rearrange the social order, that is, invert logos, in order to bring the cosmos into singularity. Darwin's order of species served as the Rosetta Stone to these aims. The possibility of human transmutation would wake the human imagination and revolutionize politics. Harold Lasky remarks, quote, "We are beginning nowadays to apply scientific formula to national problems. The statesman, somewhat to his surprise, has discovered that they have political value. It is by the standard of the man of science that the legislation of the future will be tested. And political theories have undergone a profound change since the acceptance of Darwinian exceptions." And of course, you have to plug in there the idea of the trust the science delusion that we're living under. Or I spoke last time about I spoke in my YouTube video about this within the Journals of Scientific America, that just begins with the assumption there are these people that deny the science of climate change. And obviously, they are people that need to be purged and purified. And that's what's embedded in this kind of thinking when it becomes political. And so that's why within both the communistic regime or the attempt at empire, or the Nazi one, purification of ideas that didn't fit into the singularity model. Those ideas would need to be purged. And again, we saw samples of that over the last 5 years. The idea that people that were questioning the official narrative had to first of all be socially purged, but there were suggestions that even they needed to be incarcerated or even worse that were out there. And so those were floated around. People tend to forget about what that was, but of course it will be, as the way history works, it will be repeated. According to Lasky, Darwin laid bare the laws of causality, understanding the rules by which causality operates. Quote, one can alter its course. So this is the hubris right there. Laying bare the laws of causality, understanding the rules by which causality operates, quote unquote, can alter its course. Hence, we have the potential for a new politics of science that could discern the laws of heredity and thereby understand the essential mechanism by which human behavior is governed. He laid the groundwork for future technology and, of course, technocracy. And we're living under an age of algorithms. So one of the things I suggested, the idea of biopolitics, we talked about that in chapter 1 and 2. The idea was that all of the kind of disciplines of knowledge are being kind of pulled together toward the aim of managing the body. In the classical world, the church, in its subsidiary and integral order, was in charge of the body with one purpose, and that was to get souls to heaven. In this new reality that's based on this view from nowhere, the quote unquote state, and now we have the scientific state or the techno state, is going to manage the body. And what we're seeing, it's going to operate in the inversion. And so it's going to manage the body in the city of man so that the body, mind, and soul would be self-referential in an attempt for apotheosis. but from a Christian viewpoint, whereas the city of God steers all minds and souls and consciousness to heaven, this one back to earth and ultimately down to hell. So, hence, we have the potential for a new politics of science that could discern the laws of heredity and thereby understand essential mechanisms by which human behavior is governed. He laid bare the groundwork for technocracy. I wanted to say one more thing. One of the ideas was this: what biopolitics not only controlled the mind, body, and spirit, but it did so down to the molecular level. And one of the ideas we're going to dig into within the coming chapters is, especially I like the work of Lily Kay. She came out of California Tech, which is kind of the West Coast version of MIT. And she would say this is really, especially when this gets into Rockefeller research area, she would argue there was an elite that took, she's at the very high top of the tech ladder, so she can talk about elites and conspiracies, frankly, but she knows the right words to use. There's an elite, or I've always said a cabal within the synagogue of Satan. There's a cabal, and their aims are to apprehend all of these disciplines and order them in a certain direction to decode man. Just as like the Kabbalah is there to invert the Hebrew text, which is the code, which corresponds to the code of man, they want to decode and re-engineer the code of life. And she has another book called Who Wrote the Book of Life? And one of the comments from my English friend was, of course, this is folly. And yes, that is the idea of seeing through the singularity. There was this idea within the course of human events, this idea that we're sold a progress, that we could look into the stars and refigure God's fixed nature in the stars. Or we got a telescope and we could look down into things. And like he's suggesting right here, if you can understand the causality, like the chain of events, anything's possible. You can redo it, re-engineer it, reverse engineer it. But the more I study this and what's going on, this is all folly. The more men look into space or look down into the construction of the gene, they have no idea what they're looking at. And it's all hubris because they're able to go further and further down, but they realize just like space is infinite in our mind, and going down into the cellular structure, it seems to be infinite. There seems to be structure after structure after. They don't know what they're even looking at. And there was this idea that was painted, by the year 2020, there would be the completion of this genome project. And again, once we can understand causality, anything will be happening. But the truth is, they can't control anything. They don't even understand what they're doing, much less being able to manipulate it in any re-engineer it in any meaningful way. They can go in there and bugger with it. They can damage it, I believe. But they don't know what they're looking at. They're selling the egregore, the idea, the promise that they can do something. So the project is really more trusting the science and getting you on board, because we know what they put in the vaxes, this idea to monkey around with the genes. It didn't do anything for our health except damage it. Essentially, it's killing us. But yet people still hold on to this promise because of the cabal's control on the media and this idea of just trusting the science. Don't trust your eyes and people dying dead after they take the shots. Trust the science. That's complete Kabbalah, which is just reordering. It's script writing at a world stage. They're rewriting the story of God within the context of the city of man. So yes, they have no idea what they're looking at, but I will argue that with AI, they can probably get in there and bugger things up pretty good. And I think that's in part what's going on in the book of the Apocalypse. To this end, social power could be conceptualized in spatial terms. Within creation, intention, and order, one is governed by the laws of causality. The logos represents the realm of fixity. However, with the advent of Darwin, natural beings could be understood within the laws of creation, intention, and order, and thereby transcend and inhabit a physical space above and against it through the process of inversion. From this transcendent position, he gains mastery, the ability to control creation and direct the future course of history. And I think we'll be getting to that, but from this transcendent position, essentially, we're talking about from this view from nowhere, disconnected from history, from the hierarchy of the church and of social reality that connects us to the kingdom of heaven, and the sacramentality that leads to the redemption of man through faith in the city of God. Biological racial purification. Before man could control the destiny of man, the human population needed to be controlled. It needed to be cleansed. Lasky explains the ultimate course of social power. Quote, the decline of a very great nations is probably to be traced to the fostering of the unfit at the expense of the fit and their consequent overpropagation. It was to this end that Francis Galton organized the eugenics movement, put forth as, quote, an attempt to estimate and extend the social problems in its biological aspect and an indication of the scientific means for its solution. However, Galton's movement was more than a solution to social problems. He maintained that the first society to seize godlike powers promised by eugenics would, quote unquote, inherit the earth. I'll stop there. That's the hubris of these World Economic Forum leaders. And of course, they're tied into, the masters of finance and the masters of the tech world. And so from that idea that they could inherit the earth, indeed, eugenics provided the potential to realize the ancient impulse to seize these godlike powers in order to bring creation into perfection and ultimately into singularity. So, of course, part of this hubris is this utopian notion. And the utopian notion, I argued, since the advent of Christ's incarnation, is always the idea of taking, we're wired to connect to the fullness of that incarnation and the heavenly kingdom. And when we're severed from that, we take those images and we put them into the earthly. We put them into an earthly project of man, and they're usually predicated upon the assumptions, very Gnostic, that the world is broken, doesn't accept the fixity of revealed scripture, that man is fallen and this world is going to be broken. But instead, it gets these visions of a perfected world, which we are wired into. They make sense once we get inside the city of God, but detached from the city of God, they become utopian visions. And so since the incarnation of Christ, revolutionary movements, particularly in the West, tend to be connected to this Gnostic impulse. They see a broken world. They don't see that sin in their own life and their own need for redemption by simply having faith in the promise of revealed scripture, but instead they attempt to harness all of the tools and resources of society in order to remake it. And so this is a constant theme over the last 2,000 years, this idea that we now have the ability, we've captured the resources, we have more of a monopoly on men's minds, and particularly in the industrial and technological age. So what's going on with Darwin's ideas right here, that suddenly transmutation, anything's possible. We don't even have to be burdened by the shape of this body or any other shapes that we've inherited historically. So what we can imagine could become possible. And that is the utopian idea. But even from the ancient world, it always comes back to this idea of singularity. And I believe it's because the beast system that they're following, the ethereal spirits of this world, that's the goal of the evil one, is to control and bring all minds under his control, Of course, that was the promise he gave to Christ. Bend a knee before you, and we'll make this singularity happen. Um, in order to redirect human history, the rise and fall of nations, politics, and the purpose and operation of humanity, the telos, man's perfection would need to become the aim of biology. David Starr Jordan explains, just so we know here, this quote, a lot of what I'm quoting are from early eugenics journals. So they're going to be the very early part of the 20th century. So this one is called from a journal called Eugenics Review, because I think a lot of us, this is kind of memory hold history. I think revisiting this helps us kind of see the mindset of the World Economic Forum today. So this is an article called War and Manhood from Eugenics Review, 1910, page 99. David Starr Jordan proclaims, quote, no race of men, no nation ever declined, ever decayed, ever went out for any reason except the killing of the strong and the continuous breeding from inferior stock. The blood of the nations determines its history. The blood of the nations determines its history. And so, just quickly, these ideas, I think, were propagandized and inserted throughout all the world, East and West. They were part of the Japanese mindset into World War II. They were there in South America. They were definitely there throughout the West, these eugenics ideas. And it's the idea that initially, before AI and these sorts of things, we just have the kind of captains of industry would be they would be messianic in this sense. They would be the masters of husbandry, and they were going to sort of decide who gets to mate with whom. As the story goes, after World War II, eugenics got a bad name. We think about Singer and so forth, and the kind of quote she has about getting rid of the black people, and all that became kind of politically incorrect. So these journals would have to go underground and usually disguise themselves as biopolitical, sociobiology, or molecular sciences. So the same ideas were just inserted into a new language. And usually they're sold to us like the World Economic Forum. We just want to make Granny live a little bit longer or give somebody better sight. So that's always the cover. Just like the ideas from both the American and French Revolution is this idea that these people worship equality, when it's always just like Marxism, it's a foot in the door. It's an idea of an uneven distribution of power, and it's the work of eugenicists. They want to be the husband masters of the human race. And again, ultimately, these are the ideas behind the population control. Of course, those the propaganda started with the population bomb. No, it starts way back with Malthus, at the very beginning of the 19th century, this idea that there's just too many people. And it's, maybe in some contexts there are, but this is always that's really the impulse, this desire to control the human population, to get rid of the useless eaters. The whole global warming thing that's the ruse to kind of justify, I think, the impending population reduction program that's going to be thrust upon us. The aims of this new science began to show promise in the decades following the publication of The Origin of Species. Large portions of the public began to embrace Galton's movement and to adhere to the beliefs that species were not comprised of unalterable lineages, but instead could change depending on which genes were passed on to the next generation. So again, if we can understand it, we can control it. We now have the technology. And as technology, I think, would advance, the hubris of these eugenicists would also advance. And again, the hubris would lead into the Nazi movement, into the communist movement. And I'd argue what's really seething between the ground right now is a synthesis of these two things, which is the communitarian movement. It's really the worst aspects of fascism and communism that are coming upon us. And they will be embedded into the no-hide laws. And I'll get to that. In addition, Galton's movement began to adopt a theistic character, most forcefully highlighted by his original hope of redeeming mankind from original sin so that it would become part of the religion of the future. And that's why these ideas will be embedded into Noahide law. They really are based on, I mean, obviously a strong ethno component, that there's a chosen people, and whoever those chosen people are is going to be decided by the, the commanding heights of the economy and the dominant rabbis deciding this, but that's going to be the religion of the future. And I will argue that's Noahidism as we get into, and it's going to be based on the idea that we get to decide who breeds with who merges with whom. So that religion of the future, although with the potential for quote unquote race redemption, there was the potential to transcend and unify the entire logos that might, quote, bring the human form and character a trifle closer to the divine, end quote. That is from footnote number 19. Um, Galton on Eugenics and War from 1865. So immediately it takes on, and most of these people, I said, going back to, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't put the main page back on there. Most of these people, the eugenicists, all the way back from Erasmus, that was Charles Darwin's grandfather. They did have these Messianic and other esoteric connections, which ultimately are connections back to the synagogue. And so their thinking, even though many of them were becoming part of the same bloodline, they shared that thinking. And part of the belief was that this new world would be projected through the Anglo and eventually the Anglo-American Empire. Carl Pearson notes the cosmic significance of Galton's task when he equates the crusade of eugenics with quote unquote holy war, elevating it from a science into a sanctification. Quote, let us bear in mind the words of Galton, written almost in the last years of his life, words not of despair, but of wise caution. When the desired fullness of information shall have been acquired, then and not until then will the fit moment to proclaim a jihad or war against customs and prejudice that impair the physical and moral qualities of race. And I would say that when I, wrote this 5 years ago when it was published, it's so much clearer now that that's pretty much the ideas being articulated by the World Economic Forum. That level of hubris, what we see with Harari, just boldly saying this is the moment for jihad. We're exposing it. God is dead. Those are crazy ideas you have in your head. You're a hackable animal, and the techno elites are going to do with you what they are. And he gets no pushback, except in small corners behind paywalls. However, in order for the jihad to proceed, Pearson notes, the mechanisms of heredity must be understood before eugenics can be fully implemented. And eugenics requires the fullness of information. So before they embark upon this jihad, they have to feel that there's a fullness of information. And so I believe when they were talking in that intro video, not only do we have AI, but we have AI merging with other technologies and ultimately with blockchain. And this was the idea, I believe, at the Tower of Babel, that if all minds could get together, there'd be this. That's what singularity is about. Technology. There'll be this magic because the singularity hypothesis that this accelerating rate of technology will be somehow magically catapulted, like be sort of a punctuated equilibrium, because that's what they have to explain Darwinism. As the science started to really truly observe, measure, and test some of these theories, they'd say, actually, when we look at the sort of chain of life, it doesn't operate that way. So they'd have to come back with these kind of mystical explanations like punctuated equilibrium, some of these magic explosions from period to period. And somehow we're supposed to believe that was a moment of transmutation. But true observation and measurement doesn't lead to that conclusion. It requires somebody to be trapped in this egregore that, okay, we're going to hold to our assumption that transmutation is real, and therefore we can deceive ourselves into believing that. That is prior to the, okay, it requires the fullness of information. And I believe this is what's going on right now with blockchain and AI. They believe it's time for that jihad. And I think that moment will come with what they're anticipating as a messianic moment. And even as I'm speaking last week in the United States, before a legislative meeting in the Senate, they had a visiting rabbi that was speaking about the new horizons of Noahide law. And we're so far from the city of God, which is the church, which is the fullness of reality, that they could stand with that level of hubris and tell us, this is what's coming. We're at this right now is still your world where we're pretending to go through the motions of introducing bills and so forth. But he said it right at the intro. We're going to need to have some kind of new laws. No pushback whatsoever. That is prior to the moment in which eugenics can become active. There must be an epistemological stage that provides the knowledge for operating on the eugenics level. A knowledge with the spiritual capacity to elevate man to that level. This highlights a relationship between knowledge or technological application of knowledge and divinity, which finds its original expression in the Greek myth of Prometheus. The historian G.R. Searle thus characterizes the eugenics vision, quote, man, Prometheus-like, is at last acquiring the power to control his own genetic future. And I'll remind us, the idea this is called seeing through the singularity is this is more about mind control than being able or capable of doing anything meaningful in terms of manipulating the genetic code of the human being. It's really a lot of smoke and mirrors. Parsons' excerpt depicts man as an exuberant. Parsons' excerpt depicts man in an exuberant march towards heaven, propelling himself along by means of a technologically assisted gnosis. Or I think I have in other parts, it's been a few years, but called it technological mediated ascension. And it really is more of a mind virus. It's just getting people to believe the science and dream with us. Even when World Economic Forum, you can always they're talking about these visions, these dreams. They're trying to get you into their thought virus, their egregore. We shall see how this movement resurrected the ancient esoteric impulse of man to achieve cosmic inversion and to obtain divinity, i.e. apotheosis. So that simply means apotheosis or man's divinity. That is the central mission of the Masons. It is ultimately, it's the exoteric part is make good men better, but inside of it, when you read all the writings, it's about achieving godhood, the apotheosis of man. And that occurred even before Darwin, but with the Darwin proposition here, something new is completely unleashed, that anything is possible. And so that's the bottom line. It's really following the serpent and the promise that you can achieve godhood another way. Of course, in Catholic theology, God becomes man so we can become God. And we don't mean this kind of apotheosis, not apart from him, but we want to be completely united to God and share the divinity in the way that God wants us to, and that the way we were created and meant to share our divinity with him, our place in heaven. So this is the snake's version of it. And again, when I have the Kabbalah Sephirot, that's got the snake working through it. Eugenics is a very necessary part of this eugenics project. And I'll pull this down for a moment. So again, shown before, this Kabbalah project, critical pieces of this. And this is why you read things when you read about, and we'll talk about it this week. We're going to have the Jesuit documents, and there's this need to control all of the resources of the world and ultimately mind, body, soul. So it's going to require these no-hide laws. You have to get everything. It's kind of like 1984. It's not enough to say that 2 + 2 = 5. We really want you to believe it. And of course, that's why all these totalitarian techniques of having all these inconsistencies of thought that you have to accept, because this leads to double-mindedness. And that's why God says in the city of God, don't be double-minded, because it leads to this kind of artificial thinking and inverted thinking of the city of man. So the Sephirot is part. The other essential piece is the eugenics. It's the control of humanity in order to unite the ethereal with the earthly. For now, we will consider how this renewed drive toward apotheosis was fundamentally bound up with the issue of human consciousness. From this vantage point, the new egregore, or thought form, produces a paradox in which man exists simultaneously within the existing cosmic order and the new one being evoked. The eugenicist, in this sense, has stepped outside of order in order to invert order, because he understands the laws of heredity. In D.S. Jordan's words, he now possesses the magician's wand. An editorial writer in the Eugenics Review notes, it is because we understand the laws, parentheses, of creation, that we can control the conditions of life. That's a footnote from Eugenics Review of 1917. Human consciousness will thereby transmute man into the transcendent form, because he now operates as a supernatural magician, the overman, with a view from nowhere. It's hard not to read that one again. It's my favorite from this vantage point, this new thought virus, this new egregore, this new simulacrum, because that's what they're trying to put everybody into. It's not the fullness of reality that leads to heaven, but it's a self-referential thought form. Produces a paradox in which man simultaneously, within the existing cosmic order and the new one being evoked, the spell being cast. The eugenicist, in this sense, has stepped outside of order in order to invert order. Because he understands the laws of heredity, he now possesses, quote unquote, the magician's wand. An editorial writer, and again, I didn't quote the magician's wand, that's literally taken from Jordan in Eugenics Review. We now have we have the magician's wand. Think of Hollywood, the magician's wand. An editorial writer in Eugenics Review notes, It is because we understand the laws of creation that we can control the conditions of life. Human consciousness will therefore transmute man into a transcendent form because he now operates as a supernatural magician, the sort of Nietzsche's Ubermann, with a view from nowhere. Again, I'm thinking of the picture on the front, that view from nowhere. And I think it is one that, depending on somebody's perspective, from the view of man, that's your promise. This idea that anything is possible. We finally come to a place where we've acquired this view. Somehow we're within reality, but we can temporarily have a vantage point outside it in order to cast a spell upon you and get you to kind of walk with us there. Trust the science. Trust the science. The question we must ask is the transmutation of species actually possible? Can man actually transcend the cosmic order or merely attempt to invert it? Seeing through the singularity suggests that humanity has become unconscious participants in the creation of an egregore, a thought form that has taken on a life of its own, that is bringing humanity ever closer to the campaign of Armageddon. And I think when we think of that vantage point, a view from nowhere that comes out of the 19th century, early eugenics journals are really reflecting on it and going deeper in an exposed way in the early 20th century. It really speaks to the hidden agenda behind what's going on at the World Economic Forum and how they're casting these pictures. With the advent of AI and blockchain, will be able to essentially make you live forever. And I think the way this ended here, that the suggestion, seeing through the singularity, suggests that humanity has become unconscious participants. We're walking in our sleep. It's zombie mode time in creation of this thought form. We have no alternative vantage point other than the historical church, for which on to keep this in check, that has taken on a life of its own because society itself is living in this creation of a thought form that has taken on a life of its own, that is bringing humanity ever closer to the campaign for Armageddon. And that is what I think is going on right now in the world. From my deep state view of international politics, I believe the control mechanism is behind the East and the West. That's why everybody truly went along with the charade over the last 5 years. Now they're kind of artificially thinking there's a tension between East and West. And the campaign for Armageddon is a preparation because they need to fulfill this kind of new fourth industrial revolution, this new Messianic age, with something that looks prophetic, kind of mass war, with the trials and tribulations associated with that. So right now we are induced each day that we hold on to what the media tells us and what trust the science people tell us, and that Russia's doing this and China's doing that, and all of the extremist groups are doing this and that. And I think it's preparing ourselves for something that appears to be this Gog and Magog third temple kind of thing. And it has been argued that the whole creation of the nation state over there in 1947-48 was in order to it prophetically appear, because it truly had to happen in the minds of people, that they believed that this was God ordained. And that is why I believe they stage events like the Trump ear thing, so that people repeat over and over, this is from the heavens, this is from God. And they just don't have the wherewithal to kind of see that the people, these eugenicists behind the cabal are the masters eugenicists. They want to control the whole human population, and they've been empowered to do such. They've taken on the deal with the devil, and they're working in cooperation with the dark principalities of this earth. And part of this is to have people truly engaged in this battle over Armageddon. And I think what's going on, as scripture would tell us, is that people have misplaced the categories of reality. The millennial kingdom has been put down into the earth, thinking that Christ's work was not finished at the cross, that the church is not the replaced covenant, the millennial age. They put all that into the future and into the city of man, and that they have now left the church. They're reading scripture on their own. They're pulled into all the mimetic powers of this world, and they're actually participating in the building of Antichrist, or the beast system. And I think the evil one especially wants people that say they are Christians to be part of the construction of this world order. And the necessary ingredient, of course, will be, and we'll discuss that more toward the end, will be the Noahide laws, because that has to systematically and legally take control of the bodies, minds, and spirits of everybody. So again, we have the technological piece, and we see the singularity, and we see the World Economic Forum talking about the inevitability about that. The blockchain, or what we're going to talk in some chapters about, the blockchain of becoming, being captured by this egregore, is one piece of it. And Noahide is an essential piece, because it's going to incorporate those eugenic thoughts into the very legal structure and the important pieces of population control, so that the master race gets to decide who lives, who dies, and who merges with machines. So this has been, I think, our fourth episode of Singularity and Noahide, and we were working from chapter 3, A View from Nowhere. And I hope it sort of helps us think about some of these currents in the world, so that we can sort of hopefully try to identify them, and certainly not merge ourselves individually under Noahide laws or the technological singularity. So we'll be back real soon, and we're going to continue with this. Thank you, everybody.